Kelvin from WWF Malaysia. A very good afternoon and warm welcome to all of you joining the second session of the Enhancing Nationally Determined Contributions Ambition Forum, organized by WWF Malaysia in partnership with Malaysian Climate Change Group, MCCG, which consists of three parts. We had experts discussed about NDC we want yesterday. Now we would focus on NDC for generations to come. And tomorrow at 4 to 6 p.m., we would have corporate leaders to cover the role corporates can play to enhance NDC ambition. Formed in December 2015, the Paris Agreement aims to transform development trajectories within the limits of 1.5 degrees C to 2 degrees C above pre-industrial levels and to increase countries' ability to adapt to the adverse impacts of climate change. Nationally determined contributions, NDCs, are at the heart of the Paris Agreement and the achievement of these long-term goals. According to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, UNFCCC, NDCs embody efforts by each country to reduce national emissions and adapt to the impacts of climate change. In its effort to respond and adapt to climate change, Malaysia initiated the scoping study in 2017 to develop the National Adaptation Plan, which is currently being developed underway. As IPCC and many more scientific reports indicate that climate-related risks are projected to be multiplied and compounded from the increase of 1.5 degrees C to 2 degrees C of global warming, we are here today to find out what are the key and essential considerations that shall be undertaken into an NDC for generations to come. First up, we have with us Mr. Faisal Parish from Global Environment Center with 35 years of experience as a wetland ecologist. Also advised the government on a broad range of issues related to forest and peatland management and restoration, fire prevention and control, community participation and pollution control. Please also welcome Encik Alizan Mahadi, the Director of the Technology, Innovation, Environment and Sustainability Division at the Institute of Strategic and International Studies, Malaysia. Encik Alizan led and participated in various significant policy research projects related to sustainable development and governance. It is our great pleasure to invite Ms. Sofia Castello, the lead Environmental, Resilience and Climate Change at Think City, to share with us insights on the potential of natural capital to enhance NDC. Ms. Sofia has more than 20 years of experience in designing and managing landscape and urban design projects in Europe, China, the US, Australia, and Malaysia. We are also happy to have Dr. Sharina Abdul Halim, the Head of Research Program on Environment, Economics and Social Sustainability at Leicester UKM to speak today. Dr. Sharina is one of the IPCC lead authors for the IPCC Special 1.5 Degrees Report and IPCC 6 Assessment Report, which is currently being prepared. We are also excited to hear from the youth, with Shakil Suhaimi from Malaysian Youth Delegation, MYD, and Ili Nadia from Klima Action Malaysia, KAMI. Shakil is a renewable energy executive by profession who is also active in climate policy advocacy and participated in UNFCCC and Asia Pacific climate conferences. Nadia, the founder and chair of KAMI, is leading the youth climate action-based organization that empowers vulnerable groups such as youth, women, and marginalized frontline communities in understanding climate impacts and mobilizing declaration of climate emergency in Malaysia. Without further ado, let's hear from the speakers.
Good afternoon. Thank you very much to the organizers for inviting me to this session. My name is Faisal Parish, Director of Global Environment Center, and I'm going to be talking to you about recommendations for enhancement of Malaysia's NDC. Let me share the screen. So, firstly, Global Environment Center. We're a Malaysian non-profit organization established in 1998. We're working in all of the ASEAN member states and at international level. We're specialization on working with multiple stakeholders on forest, peatland, and river management. We were the coordinator of the global assessment on peatlands, biodiversity and climate change undertaken in the framework of the CBD in 2008. I was a contributing author to the IPCC Wetland Supplement on greenhouse gas assessment, and we were appointed by the ASEAN Secretariat and the member states as technical and operational support partner of the ASEAN Peatland Management Strategy 2006 to 2020. We've been actively involved and attended most of the UNFCCC COPs since 1998, and I'm a member of the task force on updating Malaysia's NDC 1, representing the MCCG. So the current NDC 1, as most people will be aware, was submitted as an indicative nationally determined contribution in November 2015. It's currently under review by a task force on updating Malaysia's NDC 1 under the Ministry of Environment and Water. The review is currently still at an initial stage with the deadline of 31st of December this year to submit a revised NDC 1 to UNFCCC. The key elements of NDC 1 are time frame from 2021 to 2030, so the next 10 years. It focuses currently on 3 greenhouse gases, carbon dioxide, methane, and nitrous oxide. Its coverage is economy-wide. It includes the sectors of energy, industrial processes, waste, agriculture, land use change, and forestry. It has a target to reduce greenhouse gas intensity by unit of gross domestic product by 45% by 2030 relative to 2005. So what I'm sharing here are perspectives of Global Environment Center, not as the task force or not an official position yet by the MCCG. So I'll talk about the 5 aspects: coverage and policies, agriculture and plantation, peatlands, the need for an adaptation plan, and implementation arrangements. In terms of coverage and policies, the coverage is currently economy-wide, and this is supported. It should be economy-wide. The sectors which are stated in the current document should be maintained, but one of the significant gaps, which is transport, should be included. The current focus is on reduction in intensity versus GDP. However, in future, we believe that it will be better to look at a peaking of actual emissions and a reduction in absolute emissions, rather than just greenhouse gas intensity. We also believe the policy framework in the current document is very out of date and that needs to be updated, and that the planning process should be participatory, with consultations being allowed to provide input to the revised plan between now and December. However, because of the delays and the challenges of COVID-19, the time remaining is very limited to facilitate the revision and the consultation, but we hope it will be done. With regard to agriculture and plantations, we believe that this sector is one of the major sources of emissions in Malaysia and also a driver of land use change. We believe that emissions can be significantly reduced through good practices, such as minimizing or stopping any new land conversion, especially in forest and peatlands. Secondly, improving fertilizer management and enhancing use of organic fertilizers. Thirdly, improving productivity on existing land, therefore not needing to expand beyond the current land. In peatland areas, it is critical that there be good water management practices, as that is a fundamental driver of emissions. We need to stop burning for land clearing and disposal of agricultural residues and focus on composting and soil improvement. We also should be promoting agroforestry, which increases the carbon stock on the land, as well as being more resilient to climate change. And finally, we believe there should be mandatory methane capture and avoidance at oil palm mills, as that is a major contribution to greenhouse gas emission from the oil palm sector. With regard to peatlands, they are the most extensive wetland system ecosystem in Malaysia. They cover about 2.6 million hectares. That's 8% of the Malaysian land area. They constitute the largest carbon store in Malaysia, but they are a major source of emissions in the land use sector. The emissions are poorly captured in the current monitoring and reporting, and they're highlighted in the current version of NDC as a legacy issue that needs to be resolved. Malaysia has just over 2.5 million hectares of peatlands, and this is the map produced by Department of Environment last year. The largest area being in Sarawak, but large areas also found in Pahang, Sabah, and Selangor State, as well as Johor. So Malaysian peatlands in their natural status are forested, and they are the largest carbon store, and they store more carbon than all other forests combined. Conversion and drainage of peatlands leads to large-scale emissions, up to 100 tons of carbon dioxide per hectare per year from drainage and land development, and that emission can continue for the next 30 to 100 years, depending on the thickness of the peat, plus emissions from fire, which can be up to 600 tons of carbon dioxide per hectare per fire. Multiple fires will be multiples of that emission. So in Malaysia, more than 1.2 million hectares of peatlands have been cleared and drained for plantations and agriculture, and more than 200,000 hectares were identified by Department of Environment last year as being highly prone to fire. So what is the emission reduction potential in peatlands? Firstly, we need to stop further conversion and drainage of peatlands. And already the National Land Council has in December last year said there should be no further development of peatlands for oil palm, but we need to spread also to other crops and other uses that should stop converting peatlands. Secondly, we need to conserve and restore the remaining peat swamp forests in the country. These are critical long-term store, and they need to be managed in appropriate manner to maintain them for the long term and to increase carbon storage and uptake. Thirdly, we need to improve water management in peatlands, managed for agriculture and plantations. So the driver of emissions in agriculture and plantations is the drainage, and for many crops, the peatlands have been overdrained with water maintained at very low levels. The lower the level of the water, the higher the emission of carbon dioxide. So the higher we can maintain the water, the better as far as minimizing emissions and also land subsidence. We should be preventing peatland fire, which is a growing problem in Malaysia. And peatlands occur in large landscapes, and we need an integrated management program. Currently, management is fragmented between many different users, and this is a very key aspect in the overall strategy for peatland management. The next area relating to the NDC I'd like to highlight is the need for a clear adaptation plan. The current NDC does not include an adaptation plan for the coming period 2021 to 2030. It currently reports on what has been undertaken or was planned in the 10th and 11th Malaysia Plan. Remember that the NDC was prepared in 2015, so it's very out of date on this issue. It does commit to the development of a national action plan on adaptation, but unfortunately very little progress has been made in the last 5 years. What are the critical factors relating to adaptation that need to be looked at? The future climate in Malaysia will have lower dry season rainfall and increasing droughts. We will conversely have increased wet season rainfall and extreme rainfall events. That means more flooding. We will also have increased temperature and rising sea levels. So all these factors need to be considered clearly in adaptation plan and strategy. In our view, two of the key elements for the adaptation that need to be included in the future national adaptation plan are ecosystem-based adaptation. That's rather than just using concrete and building walls and infrastructure to stop flooding or coastal inundation. We need an ecosystem-based approach. That is, we use forest and mangrove protection to protect from hill slope erosion and from coastal erosion, and restoration of these systems, including the re-wetting and fire prevention in peatlands, as I mentioned earlier. So we should not just focus on infrastructure and capital expenditure for adaptation. Second critical point we believe needs to be included is community-based adaptation. This is the empowering of local communities to adapt their livelihood and living condition to change climate regime. That means they may need to change the crops that they're growing, how they're growing, the seasonality of growing. They need to have mixed crops rather than depend on monoculture, which may be negatively impacted by changing climate. And they need to look at where they're living, the towns and villages, and how those can be adapted to survive in the changing climate in the future. So finally, and most importantly, is the issue of implementation arrangements. Unfortunately, the current NDC has no implementation arrangements. For example, it doesn't say who is responsible for taking the action to reduce the emissions, who will support the reduction of emission, what resources are to be allocated and by whom, who will monitor and report the emission reductions, and who will manage and oversee implementation. Unless this is clearly spelled out within the NDC, it will not be possible to have effective implementation or to achieve the targeted emission reduction. It's probably not feasible to prepare such a detailed implementation arrangement in the remaining 2.5 months left to prepare the revised NDC. But there is flexibility that this could be prepared starting in early 2021, but there needs to be resource allocation under the upcoming 12th Malaysia Plan and other sources, for example, carbon tax or international funding to support the implementation arrangements for the NDC. If there are no resources or support or clear responsibilities, then it will not be possible to achieve anything under the plan. It's also, in our view, very important to empower or mandate each sector. So, for example, transportation sector, industry sector, agriculture sector, forestry sector, to plan and reduce emissions and set different targets within their particular sector and work to implement those targets. That is more feasible than the overall federal government trying to control everything themselves. So it needs to be a coordinated approach with multiple sectors. Thank you very much.
Good afternoon. First of all, thank you to WWF and the organizers for inviting me for the session today on Nationally Determined Contributions, or NDC, for generations to come. I have been asked to speak on considerations for NDC enhancement, and I will touch on 3 things in my intervention. Firstly, is on the level of ambition for the mitigation target in Malaysia. Secondly, is on incorporating nature-based solutions. And thirdly, is on the link of NDC with domestic implementation. Before I begin the 3 points, it is firstly important to note that the importance and the urgency of considering enhancement of NDC not only for Malaysia but globally. As I'm sure we all know or have heard by now from other speakers, a special report by IPCC on 1.5 degrees Celsius global warming indicates that we will surpass 2 degrees above pre-industrial levels, even if the current pledges are fulfilled. It states that we would need to achieve net zero carbon emissions in less than 15 years. This is a clear indication that there needs to be a higher ambition by all countries around the world, including Malaysia. In the domestic context, the NDCs are also arguably a very important policy document domestically For better or for worse, our domestic policies are based on the objectives and targets set out in the NDCs rather than the other way around. In this way, the NDCs play an important role in setting the agenda for our national climate action. So my first point is regarding the level of ambition in our mitigation targets. As you all are aware, Malaysia intends to reduce its greenhouse gas emissions intensity of GDP by 45% by 2030 relative to the emissions intensity of GDP in 2005. This consists of 35% on an unconditional basis, and a further 10% is conditioned upon receipt of climate finance, technology transfer, and capacity building from developed countries. The issue here is whether we should maintain the emission intensity target or progress towards an absolute emissions target. It does have to be stated here that Malaysia is a developing nation, and under the Paris Agreement, the principle of common but differentiated responsibilities, or CBDR, should be respected. Two important questions should be asked here. Firstly, whether it is fair contribution from Malaysia taking into account the CBDR principle, and secondly, whether it is a useful target for domestic implementation. For the first question on whether it is a fair share, the answer is, well, it depends, as it is a measure of relative growth to GDP, so it depends on various factors such as GDP growth. From an international perspective, there are various countries that also adopt this strategy, such as China, aiming for 60 to 65 carbon intensity reduction below 2005 levels, Vietnam, which aimed for 20% reduction in carbon intensity below 2010 levels, and so on. The main point here is that it depends on the rate of growth economy and, more importantly, what we mean by fair. From an overall perspective, Malaysia only contributes to about 0.6 of total global carbon emissions. On the other hand, from a per capita perspective, Malaysia is relatively high. Nonetheless, we also have to bear in mind that the NDC is an international commitment, and in many cases, it can be seen as a minimum target, and there is nothing stopping us to exceed these targets. Therefore, the second question is arguably more important on whether it is a useful target for domestic implementation, and here is where there is a clearer answer and a more important answer to the first question. Because the answer here is no, as it is a moving target being relative to growth. That in itself is not a problem if there are more rigorous details in terms of its implementation. However, there are no long-term goals, such as China has aimed to be carbon neutral by 2060 and peak emissions by 2030, and Singapore having net zero emissions in the second half of the century. Moving forward, while the ambition may remain, there is a need for more concrete and rigorous targets for mitigation, whether it be absolute emissions reduction target or longer term plans, in order for there to be more clarity in terms of Malaysia's NDC to demonstrate the commitment and ambition of Malaysia. My second point is related to nature-based solutions. Malaysia has a comparative advantage in being a mega biodiverse country. When speaking both about mitigation and adaptation, nature-based solutions can play an important role for Malaysia's climate actions. This includes reducing emissions from deforestation and forest degradation, or better known as REDD, and the role of conservation, sustainable management of forests, and enhancement of forest carbon stocks. In terms of mitigation, forest conservation can play an extremely important role for carbon sinks. In terms of adaptation, nature-based solutions such as forest conservation, mangrove protection, and preserving coral reefs can play an extremely important role in, for example, flood management in building resilience against climate-related extreme weather events. While the NDC does mention land use change, and forestry, LULUCF, as a sector, once again, the lack of specific measures means there is a lack of clarity in terms of how it will be addressed in terms of mitigation. In terms of adaptation, while there is a mention of the various sectors related to adaptation, there is no mention of nature-based solutions to solving the adaptation challenges. One consideration for enhancement of the NDC is to include and articulate the role of protected areas as a strategy for both mitigation and adaptation. This should include integrating carbon sequestration benefits in the mitigation targets, as well as having a clear target on the expansion of protected areas as part of climate action. This will also add clarity to the co-benefits for nature-based solutions through protected areas for both mitigation and adaptation. Okay, my final point is regarding the link of the NDC with domestic implementation. As I mentioned earlier, the NDC is an extremely important document in the Malaysian policy landscape as it sets out the agenda for climate change policy in Malaysia. To set the agenda, there needs to be clear policy targets enshrined within the NDC. This should include both short and long-term targets, cost of implementation, as well as clear policy projections. Moving forward, there's a need to balance between this top-down approach of target setting from international agreements with a more bottom-up approach taking into consideration the domestic scenario and capacities. Toward this end, there is an urgent need to finalize national action plans for both mitigation and adaptation. For mitigation, this may include, for example, a decarbonization roadmap, which includes long-term aims such as carbon neutrality. For adaptation, the plan should include nature-based solutions, as I discussed earlier. This, in turn, should be based on scientific projections and scenarios. The roadmap of emissions intensity reduction in Malaysia that was created in 2014 should be updated with the current situation. We should have downscale climate projection to inform and understand the risk and vulnerabilities at the local and sectoral levels for climate change in Malaysia. Only then, I would argue, can we produce a meaningful NDC that reflects both the domestic needs as well as our realistic global contributions for climate action. So in conclusion, as the saying goes, the devil is in the details. While there is perhaps a need for enhancing the overall target as an ambition, there's also an urgent need to work out the details to understand what can Malaysia's contribution be that is both fair and realistic to the NDC and to global climate action. Thank you very much.
Good afternoon. Thank you so much for inviting me. I'll be talking about the relevance of Malaysia's natural capital in the context of NDCs. First, I'll discuss briefly the difference between climate adaptation and mitigation. I will introduce nationally determined contributions with the comparison between the case of Malaysia and China. And I'll discuss the potential of Malaysia's natural capital in terms of adaptation and in terms of mitigation. So the basic differences between climate mitigation and climate adaptation, the most important difference is that mitigation is focused on addressing the causes of climate change. So it's focused on reducing greenhouse gas emissions and also in carbon sequestration and storage. While adaptation is focused on addressing the impacts of climate change. Accepting the inevitable impacts on human life, health, and nature support systems is essential for the world to adapt in the coming decades. Malaysia has severe challenges ahead, namely heat stress, increased extreme weather events, reduced crop yields, and increased food costs, coastal flooding, regional instability with increased number of migrants, internally displaced people, and refugees. The country also has very specific advantages. A very high natural capital, a high potential for increasing climate performance, and the availability of international funding due to the developing status. What are nationally determined contributions in this context? So basically, it's a non-binding commitment by all countries focused on reducing greenhouse gas emissions and on carbon sequestration and storage. NDCs are meant to be progressive. Countries are encouraged to update their NDC every 5 years from 2020 on. So reducing greenhouse gas emissions is purely mitigation, while carbon sequestration and storage can be connected to land use. There are some initiatives and some calls for NDCs to include adaptation, such as the Lima Call for Climate Action. So we see here, this is a very good graphic in which we see the different COPs, so the global, which are the global negotiations and the supreme decision-making bodies of the UNFCCC. And we see here that we have COPs yearly, but we are not reaching desired targets in terms of carbon reduction. So there is a substantial discussion right now about how to achieve these changes. And the main discussion is incremental change versus systemic change. In the case of when we look at NDC's comparison between Malaysia and China, and the way they focus and mention land use and natural capital, we can see clearly how incremental changes can actually lead to systemic changes. So in the case of Malaysia, we understand that despite land use, very rapid land use changes and destruction of essential ecosystems, the country still very much possesses extraordinary natural capital. While in China, in the last 50 years, dramatic environmental conditions led to cases such as 80% of rivers being so polluted that had no aquatic life. In Malaysia's NDC, land use is mentioned just in terms of policy, while in China's NDC, incremental changes in forest areas and stocks are mentioned. In terms of targets, Malaysia is focused purely on greenhouse gas emissions with no target for land use, while China presents 4 main targets, one of them being exclusively land use related. And we see that with this progression, these incremental changes, this led to, this year, China introduced systemic change by aiming for carbon neutrality by 2060. While Malaysia is somehow unclear what is the goal of Malaysia, what is the target of Malaysia for the coming decades in terms of climate mitigation. In terms of the discussion of the potential of Malaysia's natural capital and the need for nature, we are now in a global emergency in which we understand that more than half of the global GDP depends on high-functioning biodiversity. In this context, Malaysia is extremely privileged. It's one of the world's megadiverse countries with extensive areas of very valuable ecosystems, including rainforests, some of them the oldest in the world. We also see that the World Economic Forum are focusing on nature and the need to protect nature, as there's deeper understanding of how how providing for the most fundamental life supporting systems can be essential for the supporting of the economies. Natural capital can be more than an asset, it can become a solution. Nature-based solutions are strategies and actions that are inspired and supported by nature in order to address existing challenges. They are cost-effective and provide environmental, social, and economic benefits, helping to build resilience, and are instrumental in both adaptation and mitigation strategies. There are different types of cost-benefit of return of investment regarding investment in nature, but it's just an example. For $1 of investment in nature, a return of $9 back. In the context of nature-based solutions, I'll give the example of the case of Penang Island, the first municipal climate adaptation program to be developed in Malaysia. The nature-based climate adaptation program for the urban areas of Penang Island. It is a science-driven program in terms of designs and in terms of results and impact assessment. The problems addressed are heat stress, considering that Penang is expected to experience increased temperatures in the coming decades, increased extreme weather events with also increased in absolute volume of rainfall. And the island has already experienced substantial damage recently. In November 2017, the heaviest rainfall in the island's history led to 1 billion ringgit in damages and the loss of 7 lives. There is also the issue of social vulnerability, with vulnerable communities particularly exposed. And finally, gaps in institutional capacity. Hospitals do not identify heat stress or heat stroke in Malaysia. No municipal adaptation framework has been developed yet, and there is no centralized unit for climate-related issues or disaster risk reduction. This is a remote sensing data regarding surface temperatures, a comparison between 1988 and 2019. And we can see here that the minimum temperature has increased 2.4 degrees, while the maximum temperature has increased 7.4 degrees. So the program has 4 components, 4 goals, to which corresponds 4 goals. The first is to reduce temperatures and a urban heat island effect, strategically introducing green spaces in the city. The second goal is to reduce and, if possible, eliminate the number of flooding events using nature-based strategies. The third goal is to strengthen social resilience and empower vulnerable communities and women and girls. And finally, goal number 4, to reinforce institutional capacity in terms of public health, in terms of knowledge management, with the creation of a knowledge management platform, which will mainstream a framework for municipal climate adaptation for all cities in Malaysia. The program will also include the creation of the Penang Climate Court. This is just an illustration of different nature-based solutions, introduction of new tree-lined streets, pocket parks, green facades, retention areas upstream, swales, and bull green corridors. The expected outcomes with the introduction of nature-based solutions are the reduction of 1.5 degrees in temperatures in urban areas and 5 to 7 degrees in shaded areas 6 to 8 years after completion of the plan. A reduced impact on public health, a reduced flooding and GDP losses, reduced vulnerabilities, and improved community readiness. All impacts of the program will be assessed yearly and will be made available online via the knowledge transfer platform. The Penang Nature-Based Climate Adaptation Program was shortlisted for the Climaton Global Cities Award 2020, together with Miami from the US, Khartoum from Sudan, Dublin from Ireland, and Salvador from Brazil, and in January 2020 won the award. So now discussing the potential of Malaysia's natural capital in terms of mitigation, I will very briefly discuss the potential of mangrove forests. So Malaysia is the 3rd largest mangrove holding nation in the world. The main challenges are the loss of mangroves. Just Penang State has lost more than 60% of the forest areas since 1960. And the relevance is both in terms of mitigation, climate mitigation, in terms of carbon sequestration and storage, and climate adaptation by reducing sea level rise impacts. One of the biggest challenges is that mangrove forests in Malaysia are not legally gazetted as protected areas for the majority of cases. In peninsular Malaysia, only 0.3% of forests, mangrove forests, are protected. They are usually cut down for the purpose of developing fish and seafood farms, in particular shrimp farms. There is a global relevance of the mangrove forests of the world and of Malaysia. They are considered to have the 2nd highest density of irrecoverable carbon, which, if released, will irrevocably compromise any chance of the Paris Agreement targets being achieved. So urgent global protection of these areas is one of the priority tasks for climate action. Malaysia can play a crucial global role in this field. So just to finalize my presentation, nature-based solutions are essential because they address the most pressing climate change challenges. They build on Malaysia's most specific advantage, its natural capital. Thank you so much.
Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh, and a very good day to all. First, I'd like to express my heartfelt thanks to the conference organizer, iGEM 2020, and for giving me this opportunity, as well as to Mr. Calvin Diong for his kind understanding. I'm Sharina Abdul Halim, and I'm from the Institute for Environment and Development, University Kebangsaan Malaysia. I'm very happy to share with you today on the topic of engaging communities in climate adaptation, looking at the need of local community. I will begin my introduction by stating the fact that given the challenges and risks posed by climate change, adaptation has emerged as a critical field of research and practice. Adaptation to climate change is defined as the process of adjustment to actual or expected climate and its effects. In human system, adaptation seeks to moderate or avoid harm or exploit beneficial opportunities, as defined in the report of IPCC 2014. Or put it simply, adaptation is all about managing the unavoidable, as stated by Wire, Dovey, and Orsherton 2017. Therefore, the rapid development of adaptation as mainstream strategy for managing risks of climate change has led to the emergence of broad range of adaptation policies and management strategies globally. Success on these initiatives dependent on acceptance and uptake by local communities. To date, this uptake and acceptance remain a significant challenge. The challenge lies to the question that we all have in our heart and in our minds: who is the most affected? As we know, the impacts of climate change is being experienced across all regions of the world. Socioeconomic factors such as low income, insufficient infrastructure, high-level population growth, geographic and historical factors, gender, poor access to power, all of these are situations that not only heightened exposure and susceptibility, but also constrain adaptive capacity, contributing to the overall exacerbated vulnerability. And we see in the context of climate-sensitive livelihoods in agriculture account for more than 26% of world total employment, with high dependence in South Asia 40% and Sub-Saharan Africa 62%, reported by World Bank 2020. And in Asia, in small island developing states in the Pacific and Caribbean, we see at 31 to 69 million people are at risk. For example, sea level rise and increased wave run-up, decreased freshwater availability in which leave several atoll islands uninhabitable. The climate change impacts over the past century across most of Asia, warming trends and increasing temperature extreme have been observed. Climate change further compounds multiple stresses caused due to rapid urbanization, industrialization, and economic growth. Therefore, priority areas for Asia will include enhancement of capabilities to collect social and biophysical data, information sharing, and mainstreaming of science. In the previous report of AR5, IPCC 2014, key risks in Asia are stated here based on the confidence statements, medium confidence statements, as well as high confidence statements. We see there is a increased coastal, riverine and urban flooding, leading to widespread damage to infrastructure and settlement in Asia, increase in risk of flood-related death, injuries, infectious disease and mental disorder, increased risk of water and vector-borne disease, increased risk of drought-related water and food shortage causing malnutrition, and increased risk of heat-related mortality, where you see that it is estimated more than 350 million people exposed to deadly heat wave in megacity by 2050. These situations, these risks are all exacerbating existing poverty, inequalities, and the emergence of new vulnerability. If I mention to you all the statements, the numbers, let pictures show you how the experience shown here, for instance, in Bangkok, in Indonesia, in Vietnam, in the Philippines, skeptics may question climate change, but the impacts are already being felt and are undeniable. We see here, rainy season used to be as predictable as the bountiful rice crop. When the weather abruptly flips and becomes dry, and rain has fallen unpredictably, causing flooding, damaging agriculture, destroying livelihoods, and threatening millions of people. Malaysia, we are also not an exception to this situation, where in December 2014 and till January 2015, it was described that the flood occurred as one of the worst in the last decades, with more than 1 million people affected and losses around $63 million, crippling many sectors, affecting many lives. And these are the situations where we see happening at intense and more frequent levels. Therefore, there are many issues and challenges when discussing engaging communities in climate adaptation. One of the issues are poor linkages between local livelihoods, ecosystem function, land resources, and the lack of understanding on how communities build adaptive capacity in the face of change. And here we are emphasizing on the role of community-based adaptation. Within the adaptation sphere, community-based adaptation, coined by Huck and Reed 2007, are responses that are becoming increasingly prevalent owing to the realization amongst international community that traditional top-down initiatives have not generally been successful in providing effective and sustained real benefits to vulnerable communities. The ultimate aim of CBA initiative is to address the root causes of vulnerability within communities and to utilize the wealth of knowledge and experience of communities in dealing with the localized impacts of climate change. Therefore, this would require to understand beyond poor and vulnerable, because groups such as the women, the young people, the elderly members, they are vulnerable groups to climate change, but at the same time, they are also proactive and agents of hope for adaptation. To understand this is to understand the context, the culture of the communities, the culture that bestows a high degree of resilience on societies, but it cannot be assumed that this capacity is limitless. I'd like to share with you this framework by IPCC Risk Framework by Abram et al. 2019, in which this IPCC Risk Framework, risk is understood as a function of hazard, vulnerability, and exposure, and now explicitly considers limits to adaptation. We discuss about issues we discuss about challenges, but we also need to see what are the solutions in this situation. So there are actions to lead towards solution. For instance, in the context of vulnerability, we have action to reduce vulnerability that includes social protection, livelihood diversification, insurance solution, hazard-proof housing and infrastructure. Meanwhile, in action to reduce exposure would include coastal retreat and resettlement, risk-sensitive land use planning, early warning system, and evacuation. And in actions to reduce hazard would include ecosystem-based measure to reduce coastal flooding, mangroves to alleviate coastal storm energy, water reservoir to buffer low flows and water scarcity. And all in all, there are also limits to adaptation affected by physical, ecological, technological, economic, political, institutional, psychological, and socio-cultural factors. The picture that I like to share with you, coming from CARE International 2019, states here the slogan, communities, we bend, we do not break. Resilient communities deals with disasters and climate change. So there are many different kinds of adaptation activities that are being implemented across globally. And these types of adaptation activities revolves around capacity building, training, natural resource management practices, new agriculture techniques, awareness raising, infrastructure technology, and all of these activities are targeting marginalized group and trying to improve livelihood diversification and financial scheme, among other things. So part of the solution to manage climate changes is through adaptation pathway approach, which is seen to be a potential for significant positive outcomes within synergies for well-being in countries at all level of development. We see that there are dominant adaptation and disaster risk management pathway promotes resilience, emphasizes self-reliance, yet intensifies burden on low-income citizens, elderly migrants, and others unable to afford flood insurance or protect themselves against heat waves. Therefore, how do we manage all of these conditions is to ensure we provide consideration for inclusiveness, place-specific trade-off deliberations, redistributive measures, and procedural justice mechanism to facilitate equitable transformation. As what Ariane's 2019 states here about community resilience, where local communities, they are these climate victims. They are climate adaptation leaders. First thing to do is in building community resilience is to recognize that people are not blank slates. In fact, they have understanding of the world and changes. Therefore, we need to have balanced view on climate change. We need to respect both macro level forces, structures, and micro level social realities as well as action. This is doable, feasible by incorporating multidisciplinary, interdisciplinary approaches. Yes, they may lead to debate and disagreement, but it could also lead to new insights, new questions, and productive synergies. As we mentioned, an example of climate change solution coming from apart from community-based adaptation, we also have ecosystem-based adaptation efforts. For example, initiated by island communities. These have largely been ignored in the peer-reviewed literature, where ecosystem-based adaptation increase not only the resilience of ecosystem and communities to climate change, to the conservation, restoration, and sustainable management. While we understand that some communities can build resilience to climate change, others will face the limits of adaptation, and use migration as a last resort for adapting to climate change impacts. And apart from that, we are learning from local actors. Numerous examples, I'm just giving you some examples here, like floating gardens in Bangladesh, communities' effort in preventing crops from being destroyed during monsoon season. In the Philippines, People's Plan, where residents in informal settlement design their own climate resilient housing. In Malaysia, we have a community-based initiative in addressing resource management and biodiversity protection. So we are very much aware, and we are all acknowledging local actors and learning from them, and how communities are already, in actual fact, implementing adaptation solution, even though at times they might not call their work adaptation. And that's why it is so crucial to empower locally led action. So tapping into this existing grassroots level solution, we learning from them, we leveraging their success and scaling them up so that we can help to accelerate the adaptation globally. So what are the lessons learned and way forward in understanding today's topic of engaging communities in climate adaptation is the fact that the designing and implementing policies to strengthen local self-governance, increase community resilience in climate adaptation. Local institutions, be it informal and formal, play a prominent role in achieving positive adaptation outcome. On top of that, we also need to ensure that adaptation funding actually reaches local community. Numerous scholars now are looking into how social network matters, where the identifying key individuals are very important within a community. These key individuals can disseminate adaptation information quickly across the broad geographical ranges, and strong social networks can also improve community trust, and communities' trust on climate information, and the network may be able to overcome traditional barriers associated with knowledge sharing. Yeah. Apart from that, how to engage communities in climate adaptation, what we can learn here and how to move forward is also to incorporate into respect local and indigenous knowledge, play an important role in formulation, adaptation, governance, and strategies. We see that in all, the encompassing education role on climate change and uncertainties through the iterative process of communication, ensuring platforms are really available for all walks of life, are crucial. So why is this so? Because there is a widening gap between public awareness and of action that is needed, and also action that is being taken. So this is still a challenge that we still need to understand. For instance, we need to have a better understanding of what we can do as an individual, and in turn, in the context of community, so that no one is left behind or afraid to act in facing the uncertainties and the impacts of climate change. So with that, I thank you for your attention, and I look forward to see you during the Q&A session. Thank you very much.
very good afternoon, everyone. My name is Shakil, and on behalf of the Malaysian Youth Delegation, I will be sharing my take on NDC for generations to come. So before I go on with my presentation, I will be giving you an overview of what the Malaysian Youth Delegation is. So just to read off the slides a bit, the Malaysian Youth Delegation is a climate advocacy group whose responsibility is to amplify the voice of youth in climate movement through education and mobilization. MYD was established in 2015, and this year we operate based on 4 objectives, which have been recently revised. Number 1, just to facilitate climate policy advocacy among Malaysian youth. Number 2 is to hold Malaysian leaders as well as international institutions accountable for climate action. Number 3 is to educate Malaysians on climate change and climate policy. Number 4 is to strengthen climate movements locally, regionally, as well as internationally. So a bit of highlights about the Malaysian Youth Delegation. Ever since 2015, we have been sending youth delegations to the UN climate change conferences, better known as COPs. We constantly hold engagement sessions with policymakers/experts in the realm of climate policy. And we collaborate with seasoned civil society organizations such as the Malaysian Climate Change Group, which consists of WWF, MNS, EPSM, SEDM, as well as a few others. So below are a few pictures taken at COPs as well as COIs, being the youth version of COP, essentially. So talking about MYD's role in addressing climate mitigation as well as adaptation, I will be talking about the idea behind capacity building with the Malaysian Youth Delegation. So ever since 2015, the idea behind the Malaysian Youth Delegation is to build the capacity of young people pertaining to climate policy, specifically towards the UNFCCC, the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. So touching topics on NDCs, nationally determined contributions, Paris Agreement, so on and so forth. So just to share with you, these pictures were taken during, so the first picture on the left as well as the top picture were pictures taken from training series that was organized by that was delivered by our own MYD members. Whereas the picture on the right was an internal study session led by Dr. Gary Teixeira, who is with the Climate Change Division of the Malaysian Green Tech and Climate Change Center. So I will be elaborating a bit more on capacity building and its relevance in the next few slides. To continue a bit more on how we as an organization contribute to addressing climate change, specifically towards mitigation as well as adaptation, I'd like to talk about the ad hoc task force on NDC revision. The Malaysian Youth Delegation is actually a part of by virtue of its membership with the Malaysian Climate Change Group. So in 2018, 2019, MASTEC invited a few civil society organizations led by MASTEC itself to talk about or to be consultants in revising its nationally determined contributions, and the task force was divided into 2, one focusing on mitigation as well as one focusing on adaptation. So to be clear, the meetings, the meetings took place, but not frequent enough, where MYD actually had the opportunity to be part of the meeting, But again, as I mentioned, by virtue of the Malaysian Climate Change Group, MYD did have access to be part of this meeting, and that was an important victory for us, considering how vital it is to have youth at the policy-making table. That was such a success story that MYD was a part of. So going on the challenges faced by youth as far as climate change is concerned, well, I was lucky enough to have been introduced to the Malaysian Youth Delegation by virtue of my seniors. So a lot of my seniors back at Nottingham, well, those who did environmental science were part of the Malaysian Youth Delegation, and they invited me to be part of this organization, and safe to say I never looked back. So 2017, by the way. But outside the realm of the Malaysian Youth Delegation, outside the realm of Climate Action Malaysia, youth organizations focusing on climate change are hard to come by. Unless you are a person who are well connected within the climate change circle, and you know, or you have acquaintances within this climate change circle, you will feel as if you are lonely, that there are no presence of youth organizations focusing on climate change. But there are in the form of the Malaysian Youth Delegation, in the form of kami, Climate Action Malaysia. Yeah. So another thing I like to bring up is communication of climate change science. So it is important to see the threats, opportunities, and risks of climate change. But by virtue of it being communicated through science, through complex language, and most likely in English, the message isn't delivered across the masses of youth here in Malaysia. And that is a huge challenge that we need to address, considering how technical IPCC findings are and how non-suitable it is for the masses, youth especially. So amongst others, those are some of the challenges youth are facing here in Malaysia as far as climate change is concerned. Going on to my final slide. So as far as key aspects NDCs should include, we're talking about including youth as part of Malaysia's NDC enhancement process. And what this means is to have youth participation in crafting and implementing NDC, but also what does that mean? According to one lead author of the IPCC report, IPCC AR5 assessment report, meaningful youth participation means that youth has the right to question, interrogate, and shape the direction of climate policy and all its facets and ramifications. So it's important to note that in Malaysia's case, we do not have elements of youth within our nationally determined contribution. But we do need to have that. We need to start somewhere, and it is important to have the needs and wants of young and future generations addressed, because it is us who will be facing the worst effects of climate change. Current policymakers will not be there when the worst effects of climate change come. So first and foremost, that is a gap that we need to address here in Malaysia. Please include youth as part of Malaysia's nationally determined contributions. Thank you.
Hi everyone, my name is Ili Nadia. I am the co-founder and now coordinator of Climate Action Malaysia. I would like to say thank you very much for WWF and the team for inviting me. First of all, kami is Climate Action Malaysia. We are youth-led. Klima actually means climate in German. It's an abbreviation of Persatuan Kesedaran dan Keadilan Iklim Malaysia. We just got registered earlier this year, and we are a group that advocates for climate justice, and we try to empower local communities, mostly grassroots women and youth to participate collectively in speaking for climate. And this has been done through several strategies and campaigns that we have done for the past 1.5 years. And we also came up with a memorandum or a list of actions that we believe should be the basis of climate action. And this list, this 10 demands, I would say, have been compiled through different consultations that we did with different groups, mostly grassroots. This particular memorandum or list of action can be found in our website. So far, we have had 4 climate strikes with 5,000 turnouts. We have also assisted in different kinds of demonstration, a green demonstration in the peninsula of Malaysia. And we also have the advocacy hand, I would say, of our activity, and we do a lot of capacity building as well. That means we have had climate workshops during training with schools, universities, indigenous or asli communities and forest communities. So this kind of workshop is not just, doing climate, speaking about climate science, but it also speaks about the nuance, the intersectionalities of climate. Like, for example, what is climate justice? We talk a lot of the human rights aspects of climate action as well. So I think this is what makes the climate workshop very engaging and quite relevant to the people. And most of the people that we reached out are grassroots, and they are already communities that some of them are marginalized. So yes, and we also do a lot of climate advocacy in terms of lobbying, having webinars, physical panel discussions, and also any kind of art exhibition and art activities. We work with frontline communities. Most of them are indigenous. For youth, we work with university students, primary, secondary students, and also refugee schools. We also work with several different gender groups to amplify the gender aspects of our climate impacts with Empower Malaysia, ARO, and IRA Asia Pacific. We are trained also by them. And lastly, we also work with different kinds of groups, for example, the international groups like Climate Strikers Organization, Fridays for Future, 350.org, and we also strike collaborations and coalitions with local groups like Chera, which speaks about the haze crisis in Malaysia, and Greenpeace Malaysia. Apart from that, we also do a lot of advocacy material as well. Some of them are infographics, and we try to reinterpret or make or simplify information, basically climate information that is credible, mostly peer-reviewed, and it reinterpret into information that is digestible, bite-sized, and shareable, and also relatable to most of the use by language like BM, Bahasa Melayu, and English, so we don't get trapped into echo chambers and isolate a large proportion of the Malaysian demographic. So some of the things that we also put out are the documentation of the anecdotes, indigenous knowledge that we collected, which I'm going to explain later. And some of them includes the ecological and social assessments of orang asli communities. Yeah, so these are some of the videos that we already uploaded on YouTube. And I'd like to share about the Misi Bantu A, which is a project that we run together with Kuasa Gerimis Art Koyo and Diri Bumi Ecology. And we also work together with Epic Homes and Global Peace Foundation for this. And it's actually a disaster response initiative during COVID-19. And we have sent to more than 6,000 orang asli individuals since MCO started, and have also formed partnerships with nearly 10 grassroots community organizers to centralize resources and build shared database on OA communities of the Peninsula of Malaysia. And we also work collaboratively with other governmental agencies such as JAKWA. And these structures that we have developed collaboratively with other groups give insights to how communities and organizing NGOs or CSOs overcome collapse systems caused by a crisis. In other words, how do we adapt? So this project has piloted, so these are the kampong that we have sent aid and collect information from. And that is the first phase. So the second phase, we are now on the self-sufficiency phase, where we have piloted food gardens of 2 hectares in Pos Lanai, Pahang, to increase food sufficiency of communities that have been hit hard by COVID-19 and flood recently. So we work primarily with young couples and promote indigenous knowledge transfer from the old folk to the young. And we are investing in data collection for this project. So the localized solutions we think are important aspects in planning inclusive and ambitious NDCs, because every community have different needs. And that's why we have the phase 3, which is CHART project. So CHART aims to introduce the Kebun Mandiri project initiative through the public through exhibitions with various programming where the public can immerse and interact with the engaging information, discourses, and key community members. So some key points are how climate change affects crop production and loss of heirloom seeds, and the urgency to protect these seeds and native edible plants that can become our food bank during food crisis, or when we are cut off from the global supply chain. So this was the idea. And yeah, so some of the information that we collected are these, very basic. We are still developing and trying to compile and make sense of our data. And we share this with some of our partners. So we collect climate information where we ask the people, the communities themselves to report to us information. And sometimes we applied the women and youth perspective in the questionnaires and documentation. This really helps us during the COVID-19 response, where we send different types of aid and help to the woman, the young woman, mostly young women and young children. They have different needs, and this is something that we learn a lot during COVID-19. We have strong ties to arts community, which we have persistently co-created mediums to disseminate climate stories such as art, workshops and art exhibitions. We believe creative storytellings not only gives climate impacts a human face, it can help heal and help us reimagine our coexistence with others. We also do try to document the indigenous knowledge from women and men's perspective, and we try to, connect that how ecology degradation and climate impacts is affecting their way of life. So I think the youth are challenged by several things. One of them are eco-anxiety. So I think the youth today is bombarded with a lot of information, and at the same time knowing that the change we are pushing for does not come fast. In 10 years, we'll face severe climate impacts, but some of us still haven't got a clue what they will be facing. So just like this pandemic, we are really unprepared. So this anxiety coupled with the pressures of widening social inequalities and unemployment is really dangerous. It rendered youth immobilized. So we think that the psychosocial of youth facing climate change is not being studied much here in Malaysia, and not not understood much. And these studies has been done outside Malaysia to see how this anxiety is an impediment to climate action, basically for the young. And we also think that the other challenge are definitely capacity building and information transfer from bigger groups, more established groups to younger groups, or groups that comes from the grassroots that needs some sort of like financial aid, or need to write a proposal, for example. This kind of connection does not really exist much in the climate, I would say, landscape here in Malaysia. And also we found that there's a lack of safe space for youth to speak out about this. And because, like I said, climate is very intersectional, and it's not just only revolves around planting trees or collect trash. There needs to be a safe space for people to a democratic space for people to speak about this without being harassed or without being intimidated for their lack of information about climate. So this kind of space has to be there. And the other part that I found really lacking, and it's quite a challenge, is getting that kind of partnership, equal partnership with big and larger groups. This is partly because I think it's quite common everywhere that when youth came into a stakeholder meeting, then automatically the power dynamics are very different. The youth are a bit less experienced, but they have the passion. And especially right now, I think this is the right time to give them equal partnership and for them to bring in new kinds of creative ways to collaborate on different kinds of actions that we can do for climate solutions, adaptation, mitigation. For the last part, so we think these are some of the key issues related to the youth that NDC should include. First of all, before answering that, sorry, there's a typo here. Youth shouldn't be viewed as a singular and homogeneous age class. So there are some nuances that has to be explored, and it has to capture a plurality of youth itself and other sectors of communities. And the process of forming and updating and improving NDCs must be transparent, inclusive, and diverse. And we think that civil society organizations are underrepresented in NDC development process. It's not only in Malaysia, it's everywhere, especially in this region. So when you see, climate NDCs being discussed, it has always, for example, I'm taking examples from, say, the Citizens Assembly in the UK recently. So it brings all these different people from different sectors of the society with different backgrounds and sitting together and trying to discuss. So it does not happen behind closed doors. It happened in a very transparent way, and some of this information are being translated, some of them are legally binding, and it helps to form it helps the decision making in terms of what can be done in the Climate Change Act, or how to improve different kinds of national plans for climate change, for example. And there's also a lack of local knowledge that is being represented. So we think that these different needs and aspirations needs to be represented by NGOs and CSOs, and they have to be recognized in forming NDCs or planning. Last of all, I think because the whole of presentation talks about building capacities. So these kind of capacities, for example, like I said, how to do proposal, how to even building trust is some sort of building the capacity of collaboration. So the trust has to be there, top, bottom up. There needs to be the kind of bridge so that information or knowledge transfer between these two are seamless, are fluid. I hope that if you guys have any questions, please do email me or reach out to me, or just go to our social media and just look through some of the informations that we already put out. And yeah, thank you very much for having me. I hope that if you guys have any questions, please do email me or reach out to me, or just go to our social media and just look through some of the informations that we already put out. And yeah, thank you very much for having me.
Hello, are we live now? Hi, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Thanks for staying around, and we would now move on to the Q&A session. If you have any burning questions, please state who would you like to direct the question to and put it down into the question chat box. Please keep it flowing, and hopefully we could answer as many of the questions. And in the event that we have to close the session due to time constraint, we would revert via email. The year 2020 remains a key year for the climate and achievement of the Paris Agreement goals, as countries are invited to submit revised NDCs. Hence, this session seeks to bring together the different stakeholder voices on the level of ambition Malaysia can and is able to aspire to revise our NDC towards effective long-term responses to the climate crisis. I'd like to start by hearing from the youth perspective. We've heard from Shakil about MYD's efforts in building capacity of youth on understanding climate negotiation and climate policies, as well as communication of climate change science. And from Nadia about KAMI, reaching out to marginalized community to communicate about climate risks and develop disaster response measure. Now, it seems that MYD and KAMI are working on different tracks to initiate climate change communication and policy advocacy with the hope for a better future in the face of climate change. But essentially, both MYD and KAMI are seeking for youth and involvement in NDC enhancement process. Now, so I'd like to direct this question, the following question, to Shakil and Nadia. Could you please name the elements that shall be considered and included in the enhanced NDC, and just how important are these elements to safeguard the future of generations to come? Over to you, Shakil. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks so much for that, Calvin. So I guess the nature of nationally determined contributions is such that it's mitigation oriented. But as a developing country, I think it is without a doubt that we will be facing the worst effects of climate change. And as we speak, we are facing the effects of climate change. I think a lot of, and the matter of the fact is, when it comes to pushing for NDC enhancement, especially at international negotiations, I think a lot of developing countries are asking for the inclusion of climate change adaptation as part of nationally determined contributions. As a young person, I need to know that whatever policies we push at the moment from our policymakers are such that they can safeguard the needs and wants of young and future generations, because it is us who will be facing the full brunt of climate change in the next 10, 20 to 30 years. So for me, really, as I understand it, there is a national adaptation plan within Malaysia's pipelines. I really hope that that happens soon. But that is something I would really like to focus on. I think it's for our country to be able to, to have a plan in ensuring that we have resilience to adapt to the effects of climate change. Those are my 2 cents. Thank you.
Thank you, Shakil. What about you, Nadia?
Hi, everyone. Thank you for that question. I think one of the elements is really critical to be considered in the enhanced NDC is the gender responsive NDC, which wasn't mentioned in any of my slides or anyone's slides, if I'm not mistaken. I think consideration of gender issues provides a critical basis of understanding different vulnerability to climate change and addressing some of the underlying causes. I think first of all, gender equality is a universal human right. Everyone knows that. It's part of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, 1948, and CEDAW, which is a convention of elimination of all forms of discrimination against women, among others. So it is also a center of SDG 5. So the second part is adaptation efforts will not be effective or sustainable if they do not take into account gender, they do not take gender into account, because we all know that women, girls, boys, men, they all experience impacts of climate change in various different ways based on their socioeconomic levels as well as region, and have different needs, opportunities, and capacities to respond and adapt. We have seen this during one of our a campaign during the COVID-19 pandemic, where we sent, I would say, accountable solidarity or aid to indigenous communities. So we saw this is a structural problem. Women face additional barriers to adaptation compared to their male counterparts due to all these social norms and practices that limit their access to information, resources, and opportunities. So if this will not be considered in the NDC processes in the future, there is a risk that they will maintain and exacerbate or create new gender inequalities. So from the activities that we've done, campaigns, we found that some of the cases have led to increased workload and reduced decision making on indigenous women, and particularly at the local level. This women's knowledge is a valuable resource, and should inform adaptation measures. Such knowledge includes agricultural practices, sowing seasons, multi-croppings, herbs varieties that thrive in local climates, and also seed selection, seed storage, post-harvest processing. These are all knowledge that has been impacted, and we have no idea how this should be included in any kind of climate solutions or adaptation plans. So I think that's all from me, and thank you.
Thank you, Nadia. It's very well said, and thanks to Shakil as well. As a matter of fact, as youth would eventually inherit the world, and it does make a point, and it does good to know that both National Adaptation Plan and also the gender equality shall be one of the considerations that NDC enhancement shall include. Next, we actually have a question for Ms. Sophia. Ms. Sophia, in your presentation, you've mentioned about the potential of natural capital in both climate change mitigation and adaptation. And you have cited the nature-based climate adaptation programs for urban areas at Penang Island. And this question it's actually from Mr. Faisal. It's about, can you elaborate more on the actions that should be taken to enhance the adaptation and mitigation function of mangroves? Over to you, Ms. Sophia.
I'm sorry, I'm a bit confused. The question is to me, not Mr. Faisal.
Yes, it's actually coming from Mr. Faisal. Yeah.
Oh, okay. So the question is how nature-based solutions can ramp up ambition towards earlier peaking and carbon neutrality. First, land use is essential.
No. That is the next question. Currently, actually, it's the question is for you. Can you please elaborate more on the actions that should be taken to enhance the adaptation and mitigation function of mangroves? Thank you.
Okay. First, we have a program. Think City has a program. It's called the PRE-program: Protect, Restore, and Expand. And each of these components is associated to very different activities. The protection, most mangroves, only 0.3% of mangrove forest areas in peninsular Malaysia are gazetted as protected areas. So the first action would be to protect the existing mangrove forests. The second would be to try to restore the very large areas of mangrove forests that have been lost since the 1950s, 1960s. And then a third component would be to try to expand areas of mangroves in combination also with adaptation. Because we know extensive areas in the western coast of Malaysia, especially, are going to be vulnerable to sea level rise. And mangroves can become more than an instrument for mitigation, but can become an active tool for adaptation and reduction of impacts to sea level rise. Is that okay? Or would you like me to clarify a bit more?
Yeah, I think it's very well explained. Mr. Faisal, just like to invite you over, and if you have a further comment about this. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. I fully agree with Sophia about the 3 steps that she proposes. From the Global Environment Center, we have had a very good experience of working with indigenous and local communities on mangrove protection and rehabilitation. And I think this is in line with what was said by a number of the speakers about the community role and community-based adaptation. It's essential, I think, to engage coastal fishing and other communities in the mangrove protection and utilization. And we've also found that in some areas, such as in Kuala Gula in Perak, where the fishing community groups have done a major job of rehabilitating large areas of mangrove, they've also seen very significant increases in production from fishery products from those restored areas. So it provides a multiple use function. So it's mitigation to climate change. Mangroves is good absorbing the carbon. It's adaptation measure in that it protects the coastline against storms and sea level rise impacts and erosion. And it also provides alternative sustainable livelihoods for the local communities.
Thank you, Mr. Faisal. This excellent sample and that you have cited here. If you don't have any more comment, I would like to move to your second question to Mr. Alizan. Well, actually, in his presentation, Mr. Alizan made 3 recommendations. First, the level of ambition of the mitigation targets. Second, the co-benefits of nature-based solutions. And third, the NDC linkages with domestic implementation. So your question is that, as Encik Alizan cited, China and other countries have set a clear long-term mitigation target. What would be the suggestion for Malaysia? Over to you, Mr. Alizan.
Thank you, Kelvin, and thank you. Is it Faisal that asked the question? Yes, in terms of long-term goals, I think within the NDCs, actually, there has been a push really for countries to actually have long-term goals. And unfortunately for Malaysia, we do not have any long-term goals. That's the first thing. Secondly, our goal, of course, as everyone knows here, is on carbon intensity, which is 45% reduction in carbon intensity. So the challenge with this is carbon intensity in itself is not necessarily bad. I must state that, because Malaysia is a developing country, this will ultimately be a kind of balance between our economic growth and climate reduction. But But the reality is, over the long term, it will probably lead to rising emissions over the long term. And in that case, I think for the short term, it may be okay to do a carbon intensity reduction, but in the long term, we really need to have, where are we heading in terms of the longer term? And many countries such as China have done the carbon neutrality goal by 2060 is the long term. Singapore is by the second half of the century to be essentially carbon neutral as well, and so on. So I think Malaysia really needs to look into climate change as a long-term agenda and a long-term goal to really chart out our plan. So in that way, then we could have what could be called a decarbonization plan, if we know what our long-term goal is. In Malaysia, of course, from presentations by Faisal and Dr. Sofia and others, we can see that our strength is in our natural capital, is in our status as a mega biodiverse country. And I think here is where it's a quick win, really, that Malaysia can really focus on ensuring mitigation through our carbon sinks to go towards carbon neutrality. Another area, of course, is in terms of the energy transition that Malaysia needs to look into. Again, in this sense, that there has been a bit more clarity. We have a target in terms of our energy fuel mix. I think from my understanding, we are looking to increase it to about 31% by 2025. So anyway, these type of strategies need to be aligned to a wider vision and a wider long-term agenda for Malaysia in terms of climate change, and therefore those actions and the interventions at the sectoral level, at the local level, will fall in place with this long-term vision. Because at the moment, I think we do not have that, and it's very difficult to for industries, for sectors, etc., to really chart out their actions that are required. Thank you.
That's very well said, Mr. Alizant. I totally concur with you that without the target and the implementation framework, initiatives take longer time to hit the road. Mr. Faisal, do you have any comment about this?
I also think that Malaysia, as I mentioned in the presentation, we need to come with a very clear long-term goal, emulating countries like China and elsewhere to try to set an absolute reduction rather than just a reduction in intensity. So I think this is important. I think Alizant has given some specific suggestions, which I think are important. The forests and peatlands are one of our main assets that we have, and this is something that we should use in our approach to climate mitigation. We're often presenting the figures for emissions as net emissions, and the net emissions from land use may be emissions from degradation is absorbed by forest sequestration, and so the net figure looks quite small or positive. But I think we have to realize that we still have very large emissions from agriculture and land use sector, and we need to bring those emissions down, particularly related to forest and peatland conversion, agricultural development, and also the large emissions from the high use of intensive use of fertilizers in agriculture. And I think that we need to look at really bringing those absolute emissions down, at the same time enhancing the sequestration potential in the forest and peatland areas.
Thank you, Mr. Faisal. Yeah, we have actually heard from you from your presentation about the need to have the absolute emissions and peaking, including to minimize the land conversion and for agroforestry to improve carbon stocks. And now that you have mentioned this, can I please ask you to further enlighten us on how these nature-based solutions, such as agroforestry and peatland conservation, actually contribute to setting up the ambition for an earlier peaking and carbon neutrality? Thank you.
Yeah, certainly. I think a lot of the agriculture that we do in this country is for the annual crops, whether it's corn or it's pineapple and so on. And these crops have a very low carbon stock per hectare. And those lands originally may have been forested and then they're converted to agricultural production with a very low carbon stock. The other problem, as mentioned by several speakers, is about the future climate variability. And many of these crops are going to be vulnerable to these climate variations. Flooding, high rainfall, droughts, and other factors would affect the traditional annual crops. And so introduction of agroforestry, so that's a combination of tree crops as well as other crops grown together in a mixed system, gives a much more flexible and resilient agricultural production for communities, as well as increasing the net carbon stock on the land. And so that provides a significant function. Both adaptation, so more resilient to climate impacts. It can generate a greater net income from per hectare of land. And it also can absorb carbon, so can be a mitigation function. Similarly with peatlands, the current situation is that peatlands are a massive emission source, even though they are Malaysia's largest carbon store. And we need to reverse that high emission from peatlands and move them back to being long-term carbon stores. And they again will aim to can offset some of the emissions from other sectors. So those are the strategies. Can I also just touch on a couple of other things from my presentation and update? As you know, we recorded the presentation a few days ago, and then last week, and then 2 days ago, there was a meeting of the National Task Force on the NDC held by the ministry, and there's a couple of issues coming from that related to the queries raised by other panel members in their presentation. Firstly, the issue of implementation plan, I included in my presentation, and the government has now committed to have an implementation plan for the NDC with what they're calling a roadmap process, initially for 2 years from 2021 to 2022. They will have a specific funding available for different sectors to start implementing the NDC. So I think that's a positive development. With regard to possibility of youth engagement in the NDC process, at the moment, the Malaysian Climate Change Group has a formal role, a formal position in task force, and also representation in the mitigation and adaptation core teams. I'm not sure of the current status of CAMI and the Malaysian Youth Delegation in relation to MCCG, but MCCG could provide a mechanism through which more voices or youth or other voices are fed in, either as directly participating in the core groups or in the MCCG broader discussion groups, which will discuss the issues being discussed through the NDC process. So those are positive feedback from the latest meeting of the task force. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Faisal. Those are really interesting points that you've raised about the potential of the agroforestry sector towards the peaking and the carbon neutrality. And also thank you for the update from the NDC task force. Next, we have a question for Dr. Shurina. Dr. Sharina, in Dr. Sharina's presentation, you've mentioned about the key climate risks, the need of self-governance, community-based adaptation, and ecosystem-based adaptation, the various kinds of climate actions that can be implemented based on the IPCC risk framework, and also the need of an inclusive climate change adaptation and disaster risk reduction pathway. So the question here that we have for you is actually about the importance of indigenous and local knowledge. Actually, the question sounds like this: whether or not these initiatives are well documented, because apparently most of these are not well documented. Would you be able to advise for us to find out more about these initiatives? Thank you.
Okay. Hi, Kevin. Yes, thank you for the question, and thank you to Jasmine on this. Yeah, definitely. I think Ili also from Kami will be able to shed some light on this. She has done a very well done job on addressing this issue of indigenous communities and climate change. Yeah, Jasmine is right, saying that these initiatives are not well documented, but quote unquote, in actual fact, that there's a lot of work done on the ground. And in terms of well documented, probably referring to peer-reviewed literature. But a lot of these are also in the form of gray literature, publication, reports. But more importantly, indigenous communities are also questioning on the sacredness issue of documenting their indigenous knowledge for the purpose of the utilization of addressing climate change, particularly in terms of adaptation. So all of these aspects are being addressed now, particularly in the preparation of the AR6 report by the Working Group 2, is that the group on the local and indigenous knowledge are questioning on this, because it is seen that in the previous IPCC AR5 report, it is also the representation of the indigenous issues still lacking and not inclusive in the framing of the overall report. So yes, this is something that we are still working on, and we are working on with indigenous community with around the globe, and we are doing our best to see how the representation of their indigenous knowledge will not be in any against of their spiritual and sacred belief. That is from my side. Thank you, Kelvin.
Thank you, Dr. Sharina. Ili, would you like to chip in?
Yeah, very quickly. I think Faisal would agree with me on this. I think getting the trust of the communities is really such an important step in getting information and for equal partnership, really. So the problems in terms of the projects that we'll be running is definitely in how to upscale projects, how to monitor this project, and third, how to document these projects. Like Dr. Sharna had mentioned so well about the challenges that we've seen coming out from reports, and how to bring this information to something that is more accessible to the public as well. So I think these are the basic challenges that we saw while doing the projects, and that's the reason why it can definitely be fine-tuned, but we need capacity building. That's the main point, really. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you, Ili. Thanks, Nadia. Right. Well, actually, for Dr. Sharina, I have a question here. Actually, when we talk about the vulnerable communities, whether or not you would want to recommend to have the loss and damage to be included in the enhanced NDC. What's your opinion on that? I would like to hear from you. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Kevin, for these very sensitive questions of the big L and D, or are you talking about the small L and D here? So I think we're talking about the small L and the small D of losses and damages of climate change. Definitely, we need to address this in our NDC, and we have known that the impacts of climate change is severe, and it is the severe risk to climate-sensitive livelihoods, particularly. So, at the rate that this hazard frequency or severity increases, so all of these may challenge our adaptation responses. So we cannot avoid, but we have to address losses and damages issue as best as we can, because climate sensitive livelihoods, they are dependent on this. to see what are the pathway to move so that they are able to deal with the situation in a more how do you say this more accountable in a way. For example, that if you see losses and damages in terms of risk, if you talk about losses and damages, for example, in terms of structural transformation to create livelihoods in less climate sensitive sector, and all of these are certainly issues that needs to be addressed in the NDCs.
Thank you, Dr. Sharina. And thanks for the comprehensive explanation. I think it's well, if all of us, I believe that many of us have seen the NDC and have found pieces of related information in it. But I'm asking this because I think that probably we should have like a proper segment about loss and damage in the enhanced NDC. Thank you. I'm going to move on to the last question it's actually from Mr. Niti from EPSM. I would open this question to all speakers, but actually would like to direct it to Mr. Alizan to answer first. So it sounds, how do we evaluate whether our NDC is ambitious and goes as far as our economic status really permits us to go? Would Encik Alizan be able to help us with this? Thank you.
Thank you, Kelvin, and thank you, Niti. I'm not so sure I got the question exactly, but I think it's really a link between our NDC and our economic status because of, once again, the fact that our target is in terms of carbon intensity. So I think it's more of a statement in many ways. Our achievement really is very much dependent on our economic status, and the irony is if we follow this carbon intensity, if our economic performance is not very good, perhaps I'm not sure about the situation now, but perhaps our carbon emissions are also lower. So in that sense, again, the challenge here is tying these two together. Now, I think that is the key challenge in the context of Malaysia from an international point of view, from international politics point of view, from ambition, from an international point of view, from a negotiation point of view, is completely understandable. Again, if you want to evoke the concept of CBDR, etc., it's quite understandable that we want to set this target in terms of our emission intensity, that we are a developing country, and so on and so forth. But the challenge is it shouldn't strangle us from doing climate action and being ambitious at the domestic level. Now that's the problem here. And the biggest challenge, as I mentioned in my presentation, is we are guided by the NDC targets. I mean, it might not make sense, but if we had ambitious domestic targets and we don't want to commit that in the international level, but we have clear domestic targets and we have clear domestic action plans, I would be happy with that. But here, because we don't want to overcommit at the international level, because we want to answer tough questions like fairness, tough questions like comparing different ambitions, etc., then it becomes we become strangled between our link between this what do you call a carbon intensity. So again, it's a very tough question to ask about ambition. Generally speaking, as IPCC shows, that the ambition across the world is unfortunately not high enough to avoid dangerous climate change. So once again, I think the key thing here is our ambition should focus on what we can do domestically. That's number one. Secondly, related to that, I think we really don't have clarity of what we can do domestically. We don't know, we don't have detailed scenario projections, especially at the sectoral level, etc. So that will inform what we can do. So really, I think the next step for Malaysia is to go that way. So I don't know if that answers the question, but the point here is at the moment with our NDC, it's difficult to answer whether we are ambitious or not because it's very unclear.
Thank you, Mr. Alizand, and thanks for the question from Mr. Niti. Well, I think this is actually very tricky, and personally, I would think that it has to be proportionate with our emissions, and as we are trying to go away from intensity and to set absolute targets, it's even more difficult to judge and to balance it. Well, I guess we would then wrap up the session as we are now approaching 6 p.m. But before that, I'd just like to share that I understand that many of you would have known that the countries have been invited to submit the revised NDC in 2020. And now with the COP26 being postponed to 2021, the COP26 president in his statements called for countries to submit ambitious NDC with long-term emissions targets, as well as step up actions to help the most vulnerable in society to adapt to the changing climate. And the COP26 presidency also included nature-based solutions as well as adaptation and resilience among the 5 areas that shall be focused in COP26. And of course, there are other things on the list, which includes transition to green energy, clean transport, and finance. So before we go, let's hear from all of our speakers the parting message. Perhaps you guys would like to echo the call of action set out by the COP26 presidency. I'd like to, maybe we'll start with Mr. Faisal.
Yeah, thank you very much for that. I think that a couple of points that I want to raise. Yes, I think nature-based solution has to be part of Malaysia's, it's part of our strength and part of our potential, and it's not been realized or recognized in the current NDC. So it needs to be much more proactive. Secondly, we need to look at a real transition to low carbon development. I mean, our energy production is still way too high production of use of fossil fuel, and we need to rapidly shift to that. And I think if we can decouple the economic growth from the emissions growth, then it will not necessarily harm the economy in future if we can follow that new green growth strategy.
Thank you, Mr. Faisal. Mr. Alizand, any thoughts?
Thank you, and thank you for the questions. I think I've said what I wanted most of all, but the NDC, again, it is an international tool, but I think the key thing is we really need to understand better and look at it more from a local context. So here we really need to, again, I would echo Mr. Faisal saying, we really need a transition plan, we need a decarbonization plan, we need an adaptation plan and other action plans to move forward. These action plans should be the one informing our goals and targets moving forward. So I think before we really understand the Malaysian context, it's very difficult to do so. So I think immediately we really have to start being practical about this and really look at what are the action plans that Malaysia can do moving forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Alizand. Ms. Sophia, any recommendations from you?
Okay, thank you, Kelvin. Just 2 comments. First, I obviously agree with Dr. Faisal regarding nature-based solutions, natural capital of Malaysia as being the country's biggest strength, in which I believe Malaysia can play an international role in protecting important ecosystems, essential ecosystems for the planet. And this has to be done in a complex process, because the legal protection of legal gazetting of protected areas is done at state level. So there needs to be a federal compromise, and there needs to be a federal intervention in relation to this. Second, adaptation in urban areas is essential, because we're seeing extreme heat impacting the most vulnerable. in Penang program, we are seeing in the community engagements with the most vulnerable communities that extreme heat is impacting them much more than flooding because it's a permanent stress that they face daily. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ms. Sophia. Dr. Sharina, any take-home message for the audience?
Thanks, Kelvin. Yeah, I agree with all our speakers on the next step that we should do. And I also like to stress again what I've mentioned earlier about the addressing the lack of understanding on how actually our society are building their adaptive capacities to be more resilient in facing the climate change impacts. And there are evidence already on the ground. It's just that perhaps there need to be better integration, more platform to bring forward this great work done so that we can actually see how we can incorporate resilience in the adaptation plan that we are actually still underway, right? And then also adaptation, whatever the initiative, they should have co-benefits. It's not just for adaptation per se, right? It's also co-benefits with mitigation, with other development initiatives. So it should be integrated rather than it's, you know, done very sectorally or in silos. So I think that should be taken into consideration, as well as respecting the local and indigenous knowledge in these aspects, which as we have seen that there is still lack of acknowledgement in that, and for that reason they have already survived many different environmental changes. So we may be able to learn from this local and indigenous knowledge together with the scientific evidence. So this will be able to make it more integrated and sustainable and holistic and collective. So that's all from me. Thank you, Kelvin.
Thank you, Dr. Sharina. Shakil, over to you.
Yeah, thanks so much, Kelvin. So first and foremost, I think it's very encouraging to know that there is an opportunity for youth to be part of the National Steering Committee on Climate Change. Moving forward, I think there should also be a greater representation of youth outside of MYD, outside of kami, which leads me to my second point. I think in 2017, there was a huge, I think there were plans by the Ministry of Natural Resources and Environment to introduce environmental education within the national syllabus. Pakatan Harapan came in, and then we've got the Perikatan National Government. And that conversation on environmental education has, you know, we're not talking about it anymore. So I think as a young person, climate change education should be institutionalized within the country. Yeah, so that is my hope moving forward as a young person as far as climate change is concerned. Thank you.
Thank you. Noted. Thanks, Shakil. Nadia, any opinion from you?
Right. Yeah, I echo what Shakil mentioned just now. Definitely, we need climate education. We need a roadmap towards that. We need those kind of blueprints being, set up by different sectors. And the thing that most of us never really mention here is how are Malaysians, do Malaysians really truly know what NDCs are? Like, is it like something that is known by corporations and businesses and government agencies, but not as a layman's, not as a public? I think Shakil mentioned so well about having those education being implemented, and I think somebody asked about voters. I think there needs to be this debates about NDC as well should be. There should be a transition towards the parliamentary, a landscape. We should definitely ask and debates about these things, these really important decisions that will impact millions of people here in Malaysia. Do voters really know, what is climate change? Do our parliamentarians know what is climate change? This is something that is, I think, one of the biggest way. There is a lack of political will here in Malaysia, about climate. action. Yeah, so that's from me.
Thank you all. I believe that we all understand in various contexts that our country actually possessed the natural capital that could be the answer to climate change mitigation and adaptation, which is very much emphasized by the COP26 presidency. And I do believe that we all actually want the best being prepared for the generations to come. Be it earlier carbon neutrality, improved climate resilience, or disaster risk reduction and preparedness, which are all crucial elements in the NDC. We've really had an interesting conversation here, and which I hope that we can continue offline, and we will definitely get in touch with all and to actually continue the conversation on the NDC. But well, actually tomorrow we would have the third and also the last session of the Enhancing NDC Ambition series, also at 4 p.m., where we would have the corporate leaders with us to unpack the role corporate can play to enhance NDC ambition. Please join us. Yeah, so before we leave, thanks again to MGTC for providing this avenue, and thank you to all the distinguished speakers providing invaluable insights. Many thanks to the active audience listening and posting questions to our panel. Last but not least, a big thank you to our partners at Malaysian Climate Change Group and our team here at WWF Malaysia, Ms. Lavanya, Zara, Rosanna, and colleagues from the communications team. Thank you all, and it's a wrap. Hope everyone stays safe and well, and goodbye. Thank you.